I'm going to be doing a book report of 1984 by George Orwell. I'm going to be deep diving into the plot, into the characters of this book, so make sure that if you haven't read the book and you don't want any spoilers, that you leave this video because I am going to be spoiling things. I'm going to be deep diving into all kinds of things within this book. I want to be an author one day, and I figured if I want to be a good author, I need to read the 100 greatest books of all time. Before we get into it, I wanted to share the structure that I'm going to be using to rate the books because, like I said, I'm going to be doing the 100 greatest books of all time, and I want to have this kind of systematic approach to ranking the book so that I'm not just pulling the ranking out of thin air. So I'm going to be going over the core ideas of the book, the characters of the book, and the pacing of the book. And I have all kinds of questions that help me figure out how strong each category is, and then based on the strengths, I tally up all the numbers and it gives me this scoring of where the book will rank on the tier from S to F. The whole story is about this guy named Winston Smith, and he's just this regular guy who values freedom. And he lives in this really oppressive mass surveillance world where there's like this TV in his room that listens and watches his every move. And the whole society is very afraid of showing facial expression because they're afraid of the government catching on that they're having these negative thought crimes about the world. The whole world has this language called Newspeak, which is like a reduced English language with limited words. And the whole idea behind it is if people aren't able to talk and don't have as much vocabulary, they're not going to be able to have these negative thoughts about the government. Now, Winston works for the government. He works for the party. And in his job, he basically alters and does this kind of forgery of documents so that things always fit the narrative at the present moment. But because of that, people never know what happened in the past. And Winston seems to be the only one that remembers that only a week ago they were at war against the different state. There's another character in the story. Her name is Julia. She works for the party as well. She ends up having this love affair with Winston throughout the story, which is very illegal. You're not allowed to have love affairs. The whole idea behind that is that you only have love for Big Brother, which is the government, and you won't have any love for anyone else because if you loved your wife, you might betray the government, which would be bad. So there's three main characters to the book. There's Winston, the main character, Julia, his lover, and then this guy named O'Brien. So throughout the story, Winston and O'Brien will exchange glances, and Winston thinks that O'Brien is on his side, that O'Brien is also rebellious and has these thought crimes against the government, only to realize later that O'Brien was on the government side the whole time. The first thing that we're going to be deep diving into are the core ideas of the book. So I have some questions that I'm going to be hammering through that help me identify whether or not this book did a good job with the core idea, with the themes, with the messaging. So the first thing that I was looking at is there a core question to the book? Is there a central question guiding the book forward? So for 1984, the main question that is kind of encircling the whole narrative is what would happen if a free man who had his own free thoughts was living in a totalitarian mass surveillance world where he couldn't even have a negative thought about the government? How would his life be affected living in that kind of world? My next question is there a clear protagonist and an antagonist to the book? Winston is the protagonist, and he has a clashing idea with the antagonist, which is Big Brother. So Winston values freedom versus Big Brother values conformity. So both of those ideas are clashing throughout the novel, and you need that because if you have no conflict, then the story can't move forward. Conflict is what shows the true character of a character. It's like you don't know how you're going to behave in a war situation until you're put in that war zone. We all think that we're going to be acting in a heroistic way, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. Like you might be put in a position where you're getting tortured and you think that you would never betray your family, but you do, because you don't know until you're put in that situation how you're going to behave. And that's why conflict is so powerful, because it really drives the story forward. The other thing I was looking at is whether or not the book had an evergreen message or a lesson. You don't want to read an entire book only to realize at the end that it didn't really have anything to say. Story is such a powerful tool, and it really helps people come to a realization without living something. And I think the reason this book was such a hit is because it's so hard-hitting. It shows this message of what could happen, like a warning if the government ever overreached. Is the world believable? I think that George Orwell did a really good job at this too, where he portrayed every aspect of the world, of what would truly happen if we lived in a society like that. Like, imagine you couldn't have love marriages anymore. Humans still have that desire, that physical desire. So things like prostitution on the black market would be a thing, right? There'd be a different class of people. In the book, he talks about the party members, and then there's the proles, which are this underclass. So it's very interesting to see the divide. He buys a journal on the black market. So there would be a black market if the government was overreached like that. Kids betraying their parents, taught in school how to identify thought crimes, how to monitor micro expressions on their parents' face, and because of that, they betray their own parents, which just really shows you how the whole government surveillance thing would happen, because they would definitely indoctrinate our children. I did not feel like Winston had a clear journey, that he had something that he was really rooting for, that he was looking for. I'm looking at what he wanted. What did Winston want? I felt like I didn't really know what he wanted throughout the book. Did he want a life with Julia? Did he want to join the Brotherhood and become rebellious? What did he want? It was very unclear to me what he wanted, and because of that, I wasn't able to figure out the stakes. For example, if he would have wanted a marriage with Julia or a family with Julia, he had like this perfect future life planned out. Well, the stakes are that if that's all taken away, he would be devastated. The second thing I looked at was, do I care about the supporting characters? Julia, his lover, I didn't really care about her. I didn't know enough of her background story to really fall in love with the character. She didn't show any vulnerability when she was with Winston. She was just very superficial. It was a very superficial level relationship. I didn't know why she was the way she was, and it just made me not really want to keep reading the book. There was many times when I was reading where I was just like reading for the sake of reading and not reading because I was immersed in the story. Is the main character likable? Winston was very difficult to like. For example, he said, "I hated the sight of you. I wanted to rape you, then murder you." This was something that he said to Julia on their first encounter when they had some time in private. And that doesn't really depict him as this nice man, right? They talk a lot about his backstory, about how he starved his mother, or at least he felt like he starved his mother by being greedy. And his whole persona at the beginning of the story is just very negative. He's misogynistic, he's very selfish, and then you would think that throughout the middle of the story, when he has this love affair with Julia, that maybe he would soften up a little bit, maybe he would show some love towards her, but that didn't really happen. He was unlikable at the beginning, and then he was unlikable at the end. So when he betrayed Julia, it almost felt like, of course he did. Like, we've seen this of him throughout the whole story, and he hasn't changed. Another thing that I was looking at is if the character was predictable. So he was definitely predictable because, like I said, he was a bad guy at the beginning, bad guy at the end. I kind of knew he was a coward throughout the story. Did the character transform? Like I said, he didn't transform, so I gave it a no. Moving on to the third thing, pacing of the story. So there's this thing called story versus plot. So a story is saying the king died, then the queen died, versus plot is saying the king died and then the queen died of heartache. Plot is when something happens and then something else happens because of it. It's a cause-effect relationship. In 1984, I felt like it was just a story. There was no thing that was triggering the other thing to happen. For example, when Julia first approaches Winston, she just gives him a note that says, "I love you." And there's no context. There's no reason why she's in love with him. It's just very random. It's like if I went to the grocery store and somebody just handed me a paper that said, "I love you." Like, there's lacking a reason behind it. Things are just kind of happening for the sake of happening. And that makes the story boring and just not captivating. There's no tension there. There's no reason for me to want to keep reading the pages. Is there mystery? Are there open-ended questions at the beginning of the novel? I feel like George Orwell did a really good job at doing this. In the first pages, he talks about Hate Week, he talks about Big Brother, and he doesn't expand on it, which is good because it leaves that curiosity of what is happening, who is Big Brother, what is Hate Week. And because of that, you're more invested because as you read the novel, you're seeking bits of information that are going to help you figure out what those things are in your mind. Another thing I was looking at is the show don't tell. I feel like George Orwell did a really good job at this. He was able to describe certain things only for you to realize later down the page that it was bad. For example, in the book, he pulls out this notebook and George Orwell describes what the book looked like, how the pages were, he describes where the main character bought the book, only to later figure out down the page that it's illegal to possess a notebook like this, and that to write something in a notebook is a thought crime, and you don't really see it until you read further down. So he does a really good job of like showing it first and then telling you after, instead of, for example, I think of myself, I probably would have said something like, I pulled the illegal notebook out and I was doing something I shouldn't be doing. But by saying that, I almost squash the mystery, because people already know, like right off the get-go, that the notebook is bad, versus saying and describing the notebook and then you finding out later that it's a crime. It's just more intriguing. In terms of his writing style, I felt like it wasn't done the same way that I would do it. There was a lot of flashbacks, a lot of dreams. There was, at one point, he starts reading this book out loud to Julia, and it's so unnecessary. The book excerpt that he has is about 30 pages. Like, that is not necessary at all. I felt like he did this a lot with flashbacks and dreams and just disconnecting you from reality. For example, there's like this lady on the screen prompting them to do exercises, and then as he's doing the exercises, his mind wanders to his mother and he has like this whole flashback of his mom. But it's just hard to follow the story. And because of that, I would say that the writing style wasn't really my cup of tea. He often went into big detail about the politics of the story, about Eurasia and East Asia, and it was just unnecessary in my opinion. I felt like he could have done a better job by weaving those political things into conversation between people while he was doing something, instead of just flashing it back. The next thing I was looking at too was how the elements of the story work together, how the ideas flowed. So in the beginning of the story, it starts off with Winston walking up to his apartment, and then they describe the scene of what's happening, and then Winston pulls out this notebook. He's kind of hidden in a nook so that the telescreen can't see or hear what he's doing. And then right before he sits down to write down his thoughts, he recalls this trigger incident that happened when he made eye contact with O'Brien, and that kind of triggered him to want to buy a diary and start this thought crime, which is writing in the novel. I feel like for myself, the back and forth of flashback thoughts and stuff just wasn't cohesive for me. I feel like it would have been better for him to start the story with Winston at work, with him making the eye contact, and then from there he goes and buys the notebook. You give a bit of backstory of the black market, things like that, and then from there he goes to his apartment and starts writing. I feel like just the structure of things, he had all the proper elements of the story. He had a good inciting incident, he has rising actions, but they were just so peppered in and kind of like all over the place that it was hard for me as a reader to follow the story. And sometimes I was like, okay, where am I right now? Like, what is going on? I feel like if he would have done it more linearly, it would have made a lot more sense and I would have been more invested, because things would have been happening because of something, versus the way he kind of wrote it, it almost felt like things were just happening and he was recalling things, kind of going back to story versus plot. The last thing that I was looking at was the point of view of the story and if the point of view fit the narrative. The book is written in the third person only focusing on Winston, and because of that, I feel like we really lacked like that emotional connection with Winston. There was just no humanity to him, which is probably what George Orwell was trying to depict, is that if you got brought up in a world like that, that you would have no human qualities, and kind of show the horror of living in that way. But it just made me not care about him as a character, like I said before, and you need that. I feel like I could have been crying by the end of this novel, just putting myself into the pages, knowing that, you know, I love my husband so much, and to see the betrayal and to really put myself in the shoes of being betrayed by someone I love so deeply. But because I didn't feel the love between them, it was hard for me to immerse myself into the story. With all that being said, I gave it a 10 out of 15 marks, which ranked it a B on my scale. It was a very good novel, and I think that the main thing that carried me through it was the theme and the message, But for myself personally, I want to really immerse my reader into the story. I want to have really good stakes. I want to be emotionally invested. So the main takeaway that I'm taking from 1984 is the message and the theme, and trying to incorporate a really evergreen message in my story as an author moving forward. So thank you for sticking around for the whole video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. I'm going to be going over A Tale of Two Cities next by Charles Dickens, so if you're interested, you can watch that one after. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.